Sure. You know, again, the local is, when you're looking at something like Chipko and Chiapas and those kinds of things, I think you can do ecology at the local level. But when you're doing large animal conservation, the local is often, as I said, the victim. And so it's a little more complicated for me. But sidestepping that question, I do think that there are lots of ways of tying this together. I mean, you mentioned the Gaia sort of ecofeminist theology. You know, even evangelical Christians now have this creation care kind of buzzword. I think there's other theories that we have available to us to help think about ways of formulating a larger project than a local. Pantheism, process theology, process thought, Alfred North Whitehead. Sometimes when you talk, or when I read you, Tim, I think Buddhism. I don't know if that's even Hinduism, especially in relation to animals.
That happens to me too.
But you think Buddhism?
when I talk. Yeah.
You know, I mean, there are other non-Western formulations or non-Enlightenment formulations that could posit the earth and its materiality. It's not denying materiality, it's interpreting it differently. Like I think of the Native American, I mean, this is Vin de la Rosa, position that places are saturated with ancestors. That's why you can't buy and sell them. And, you know, I think about how different that worldview is from people who buy cemetery plots to die in. And that, you know, we've just sort of come such a long way, or such a far way, as a result of capitalism and Enlightenment individualism. And that there are lots of tools out there to weave this back together. A lot of them have pitfalls that we have to talk about, but I think those things for me are healthier than a global ledger of accountability, because from the perspective of animals, who owns them? You know, do Africans own their animals now, or do we all own them? We killed all ours in North America. Why do we get theirs? Yeah,
Yeah.
I'd like to go back to the question of the concept of environmental racism. Ask you to talk a little bit about something that's come up, particularly around transgenic experimentation. Bioethicists talk about this. Carrie Wolf, literary critic, several other literary critics. The concept of speciesism and racism, whether where that boundary is, how you understand those two things together. I mean, Kathy, we're talking about these theologies, how they might help us. Personally, I don't want to see speciesism as a continuation of racism. I really think these are different questions. But again, transgenic experimentation, which seems at the heart of a lot of what you're talking about, has raised that issue of, you know, the boundary of the human. So I'm wondering if that's a direction we take the conversation.
You know, yes. I mean, the animal rights people always sort of want to go from, you know, racism and slavery into liberation of animals. And I resist that too. And part of the problem here is that we only have this one category, right? We got this category human, and we have other.
Yeah.
And so racism in some ways, or the eradication of racism, was about getting dark-skinned people into that category. I don't think it's the right thing to push animals into that category. They're not, right? They don't have the same capacities, abilities, etc. It's not to say they're lesser. We have to have we need another model that's not just about the human and the other. And that some of these other systems, like Buddhism or Aboriginal, you know, certain Aboriginal, can give us insights into how to sort of challenge the validity of the human. I mean, this is the nature-culture thing, right? Culture's anything humans do, nature's everything else. And it's that we have to kind of figure out how to disrupt. And so, no, I'm not in favor of giving animals rights. But I'm not sure I'm in favor of rights for anybody at the moment.
Can I speak to that a little bit? Because I've been through a very, very short
version of what Kathy so eloquently just explained. And it's so great to do this panel because it's almost as if we're telepathically.
And we just met an hour ago.
I wasn't meaning to be flip. I want to say when I said that some of my thoughts I recognize Buddhism because I study Buddhism very seriously, and I think that actually that's a major problem. I'm not answering your question, of course. All of a sudden, that's a major problem for us humanists. Yeah, that there's a kind of hangover of Orientalism and primitivism and exoticism in our resistance to like embrace and explore and get into other non-Western, whatever you want to call them, ways of thinking about things. And I think in a way, in a strange paradoxical way, at least the way in which a certain kind of Foucault, a certain kind of Derrida, a certain kind of Deleuze and Guattari has been received in the academy, even in post-humanism, let's say, hasn't really helped very much because there's a sort of phobia there of subjectivity, and that's what it boils down to, is an idea that subjectivity as such is a toxic category that needs to be either gotten rid of, but nobody really does that, or ignored, you know. And so in some way, when people bring up spirituality, I think we need to have a conversation about how these things can actually enhance a left view, even if for just for the strategic reason that we don't want the right owning all that stuff, right? So yes, speciesism and racism, firewall separation for me. I disagree profoundly with Kerry on this. The idea that speciesism subtends racism is itself a speciesist concept, and furthermore a racist one, you know, to the extent that The Descent of Man, for example, was written to, you know, attack the idea that race was a biological category, right? That actually race as such is a racist category, according to Darwin, because most of why I look the way I look is because contingently someone thought that way was sexy about 3 million years ago, possibly with no other competition around, right? So there was it wasn't a Kantian taste thing where somebody exhibited good taste. They just happened to like the way reddish facial hair and white skin was, yeah? And so from the evolutionary point of view, and this is also where queer theory gets into at least mammals, there's this concept called satisficing, which basically means that if you've got it and it's not killing you, you can keep it, right? So whatever trait you have, you can keep it from an evolutionary point of view. There's no reason why some things happen the way they happen. There's no reason why. When you start looking for reasons, you're already locked into a kind of problematic discourse there. So I don't think that speciesism subtends racism. In fact, quite the other way around. I think there's some kind of way in which racism percolates into environmental thinking through this notion of species, through this notion of other. I'm very troubled by this word other, and I'm trying to come up with something else, and what I'm coming up with is strange stranger, which is my bad translation of the Derrida's word arrivant, right? Which is imagine a visitor that you couldn't possibly anticipate, that you couldn't possibly prepare for enough, that you couldn't possibly. So that idea that basically, you know, and we are those strange strangers too, right? So that in ecological thinking is a strong vein of uncanniness, right, which has been edited out of a lot of ecological language, which paradoxically actually performs the same function in a way as the Foucauldian, Derridian sort of diluted version or mistranslated version that some people have, which is this sort of subjectivity phobia idea. That basically somehow there's this thing, from the deep ecology point of view, there's this Gaian system that just works. Human beings are like a viral kind of aspect of that may or may not be wiped out, who cares, right? In a way, that is capitalist ideology, just in a very kind of seemingly anti-capitalist key, you know. And it has to do with this sort of terror of actually being a subject. Being a subject means feeling very weird, you know. At least me, as an introverted person, I think subjectivity is feeling very weird, which involves uncanniness, which involves hesitation, which involves a feeling of irony, you know. So any view that doesn't have irony in it. It's intrinsically suspicious. And I don't mean irony like a sort of T-shirt, I'm so cool irony. I mean really serious irony that makes you feel a bit ill. You know, sort of, in a way, science is irony because science is being ready to be wrong. You know, isn't that what irony is?